Black CEO, publicly mocked by billionaire white family, then he cancels the $50B deal. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's video, I need your help. We've noticed that the channel is losing traction, and subscribing is one of the best ways you can help us. It's quick, free, and allows us to continue bringing you great content. Your support means everything. Let's keep this channel growing collectively. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get back to the story. Clean floors, that's your job. The words sliced through the ballroom air like a whip. Crystal chandeliers sparkled above a sea of tuxedos and champagne flutes. Laughter spilled across the marble floor, the kind that comes easy when power feels inherited, not earned. Malcolm Reed didn't answer. He just stood there, tall, poised, every inch of control wrapped inside a black tuxedo that fit like discipline. The room had mistaken calm for servitude. "Excuse me?" one of the women said, eyes gleaming with cruelty disguised as charm. Her diamond bracelet caught the light as she pointed toward a spill on the floor. "That's dripping near your shoes. Be useful." The table erupted in snickers. Edward Langford III, heir, investor and expert in arrogance, leaned back in his chair. "I told you, these events need better staff screening," he muttered. Malcolm's jaw flexed, but his tone stayed even. "You might want to lower your voice," he said quietly. Edward scoffed. "Oh, why are you the ballroom manager?" "No," Malcolm replied, adjusting his cufflinks. "I'm the reason this ballroom still exists." The group blinked, not processing it. The blonde woman laughed again, nervous this time. "That's cute," she said. "Maybe take your attitude back to the service corridor." Malcolm lifted his phone slowly, pressing one button. "Proceed with the update," he said into the receiver, "and log everything that happens in this room." The laughter wavered. "Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you believe in dignity and justice, hit like and subscribe. These stories spark change, and we're glad you're here." Now, back to Malcolm Reed. He turned slightly, catching his reflection in the gold-trimmed mirror behind them, the same mirror that once reflected men who'd been told the same line. "Clean floors. That's your job." His father used to work hotel maintenance. Same uniform, same look from strangers. Malcolm remembered coming here as a boy, watching guests pretend not to see him. Now the same marble floors they once walked over were owned by him. Edward clapped twice. "Security!" he called, amused. "Someone's clearly lost." But no guard came. Only a young Latina server near the buffet, eyes wide, phone trembling in her hand. She was recording not for views but for proof. Malcolm noticed her, gave a small nod that said, "It's all right. Let them finish." The laughter returned, thinner now, trying to recover its confidence. The blonde leaned in, whispering loud enough for him to hear. "You people always think you belong where you don't." Malcolm didn't blink. He whispered into the phone again. "Stage 2 confirmed?" A calm voice replied, "Yes, sir. Protocol 7 active. The $50B merger on hold pending your word." He ended the call. The music still played, violins swirling above a silence too tight to breathe. "Clean floors?" he repeated softly, almost to himself. "Maybe, but tonight I'm cleaning house." And with that, the power in the room shifted quietly, irreversibly. The ballroom settled into a low hum, that uneasy silence that follows when laughter dies too late. Malcolm Reed stood near the marble column, hands steady, phone now lowered at his side. The orchestra played a slow jazz number, pretending nothing had happened, but every note sounded guilty. He scanned the room, men in tailored tuxedos, women in silver gowns, all orbiting around money like moths around light. This was their world, but it had been built on his balance sheet. No one here knew that Reed Global Holdings quietly owned 47% of Langford International, the family empire currently negotiating to merge with his firm. To them, he was a +1, a background figure, a man who belonged near the catering staff, not the chandelier. He liked it that way. Disguise was data. Silence was leverage. A waiter brushed past him, whispering, "Sir, they think you're staff." Malcolm gave a small, calm smile. "Good," he said. "Let them show me who they are when no one's watching." Across the room, Edward Langford was still laughing too loud, the sound of a man clinging to dominance. His fiancée, The blonde who'd mocked Malcolm first leaned close and whispered something. Edward smirked, raised his glass, and said just loud enough, "The help's getting bold these days." A ripple of laughter again. Lighter. Nervous. Malcolm didn't move. He only glanced at the ornate clock above the bar. 9:47 p.m. The moment would be logged. His assistant Carla was watching the live feed from New York, time-stamping every remark. He'd learned long ago that humiliation was currency, and he never wasted it. He turned slightly, catching sight of the young server still recording. She froze when his eyes met hers, afraid she'd crossed a line. Malcolm gave her the faintest nod, a silent promise that she wasn't the one in trouble. She lowered her phone, relief washing over her face. Then a voice behind him, an older woman. Another guest whispered to her companion, "He looks familiar. Where have I seen him?" The man shrugged. "Probably security." Malcolm almost smiled. They always saw the suit, never the man inside it. He thought of his father again, Harold Reed, who'd mopped these kinds of floors for 30 years. Every night, he'd come home with the smell of polish and pride. He used to tell young Malcolm, "People's tone tells you more than their words ever will." And tonight, the tone in this ballroom told him everything. Carla's text buzzed on his phone. "Protocol 7 confirmed. Board on standby. Proceed when ready." He slid the device back into his pocket, took a slow breath, and rejoined the circle near the champagne tower. "Ah, there you are," Edward said, feigning warmth. "We were just discussing our potential partnership. You might learn something if you stay quiet." Malcolm lifted his glass not to toast, but to mirror. "I always do," he said softly. The blonde tilted her head. "Do you even understand what a merger is?" Malcolm's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Better than you understand who you're talking to." The words hung there, calm but heavy like thunder choosing whether to fall. Somewhere near the entrance, the doors opened, and two men in dark suits entered. They weren't security. They were Reed Global executives, arriving right on cue. The orchestra's tempo shifted. The night, once owned by arrogance, was about to belong to silence. Edward Langford raised his glass again, voice loud enough for every chandelier to hear. "So," he said with a smirk, "what exactly do you do here, my friend? Shine the silverware or sweep the floor?" The laughter came on cue, polite, performative, cruel, the kind that fills silence before guilt can. Malcolm didn't flinch. He simply placed his empty glass on the table, aligning it perfectly with the others, as if to prove he still had control of at least one thing in the room. "I build things," he said evenly. "Mostly companies, sometimes people." The blonde giggled. "Oh, a motivational speaker? How adorable." Her words carried the sweetness of poison. Around them, a few younger guests looked uncomfortable, eyes darting toward the exits. But no one spoke. No one ever did. Then Edward leaned forward, elbows on the table, tone dropping low. "Listen, I don't know which door you came through, but this event is exclusive. Security must have missed you." He motioned toward the guards stationed at the far end of the ballroom. "We'll fix that." Malcolm stayed silent, watching the two guards exchange a glance. One began walking his way. The orchestra kept playing a violin solo, trembling under the weight of tension. Before the guard could reach him, a woman's voice broke the rhythm. "Excuse me," said a young Latina server, the same one who had been filming earlier. Her hands shook slightly as she held a tray of empty glasses. He's not staff. I saw his name on the guest list." The table froze. Edward's head snapped toward her. "What did you just say?" Her courage wavered but didn't die. "Reed. His name was on the list. Near the top. 7-7 heard Saul peer intin 7 feel wild of 7. In my follows in the cause." The other guests shifted in their seats. The blonde muttered, "Probably a typo." Edward sneered. "Honey, I own the list." Malcolm's voice cut through like the first crack of thunder. "Then you already know how badly it's about to cost you." Edward frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" Malcolm didn't answer him directly. Instead, he turned to the server. "Thank you," he said, tone soft but final. "You've done your part." The guard hesitated, unsure now whether to act. Malcolm reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out a black card with silver lettering. He laid it flat on the table in front of Edward. The logo at the corner gleamed under the chandelier. Reed Global Holdings. "Ever heard of it?" he asked quietly. Edward blinked. "Of course. They're our acquisition target." "Were," Malcolm corrected. Past tense. The word hit harder than any shout could. Conversations across nearby tables began to fade. Heads turned. Whispers rippled. Even the musicians faltered for a beat before recovering. Malcolm looked at the guard still hovering nearby. "You can stay," he said calmly. "You're not the problem tonight." The guard nodded once and stepped back. Edward forced a laugh, desperate to regain control. "Cute trick. You really think anyone believes you own that company?" Malcolm's gaze didn't waver. "I don't think," he said. "I know. They were heavy massible to the racist firing on the bro file and half-pans of defense for Mune." From across the room, his executives, the two men in dark suits, were already approaching, their expressions professional, deliberate. The crowd parted instinctively. The young server's eyes widened as she realized what was happening. She whispered under her breath, "Oh my God." Edward's fiancée shifted in her seat, face paling, as she finally connected the name to the deal. "Wait," she whispered. "Malcolm Reed? That's—" Edward swallowed hard. The smile he'd worn all night faltered. Malcolm turned slightly, his voice calm, but absolute. "Tell me, Edward," he said, "what does it feel like to mistake ownership for service?" No one answered. The orchestra's final note hung in the air, trembling, unresolved. No one spoke. The chandeliers still glittered, but the air beneath them had turned thick like the moment before a verdict. Malcolm Reed didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His stillness did the shouting for him. Edward Langford III sat half smiling, half sinking. The confidence on his face was starting to crack like porcelain. His fiancée reached for his arm. He brushed her off, too proud to admit the ground was shifting. "Look," Edward began, forcing a laugh that no one joined. "Maybe this is some kind of misunderstanding." Malcolm turned his gaze toward him, a gaze so calm it felt surgical. "You're right," he said. "The misunderstanding was thinking I needed your approval to be here." A murmur rippled through the nearby tables. A few guests looked down at their glasses, pretending fascination with their reflections. Others subtly pulled out their phones, recording under the cover of curiosity. The orchestra, sensing the shift, slid into silence mid-song. The quiet was unbearable. Edward broke first. "All right, enough theater," he barked to the guards. "Escort this man out." But the guards didn't move. They had already recognized the two executives approaching behind Malcolm men. They'd seen in news articles, Forbes covers, board meetings streamed across networks. Reed Global wasn't just a company, it was a constellation of power. "Sir," one guard muttered to Edward. "Maybe we should—" Edward cut him off. "Do your job." Malcolm's tone stayed even. "They are." He took one step forward. Not aggressive, just decisive. The crowd instinctively shifted back, like the tide yielding to gravity. "You called me staff," he said. "That's fine. I've cleaned worse messes than this deal." The blonde exhaled sharply, trying to find her footing. "You're exaggerating. We were joking. You people are so sensitive these days." Malcolm's eyes didn't blink. "No," he said. "I'm just attentive." He reached into his jacket again and took out his phone. The screen glowed faintly in his palm, lighting the edges of his expression. "Carla," he said into it, his voice measured, precise. "Confirm phase 2. On the other end, his assistant's tone was crisp, audible enough for the nearest tables to hear. "Confirm, sir. Board approval received. Merger officially suspended." The words dropped like stones into water. Ripples of whispers spread instantly. $50 billion. Suspended. He just said suspended. Edward's chair scraped back. "You can't do that," he stammered. "That's not how business works." Malcolm looked at him the way a surgeon looks at a tumor detached, inevitable. "Business works exactly how I decide when you're on my payroll," he said quietly. Across the room, the young Latina server pressed a hand to her mouth. One of the guests near her whispered, "That's the CEO? The Malcolm Reed?" She nodded, trembling. Edward slumped back into his seat, trying to laugh it off. "You think you can embarrass me in my own event?" Malcolm tilted his head slightly. "Embarrassment," he said, "requires reputation. You sold yours the moment you opened your mouth." The words landed with surgical precision, not shouted, but cut clean. He looked toward the bandleader and said calmly, "Play something soft. This deal's over." "This find." The musicians obeyed without hesitation, striking a slow, haunting melody. It filled the room like fog. Malcolm turned, walking toward the balcony doors with deliberate ease. Every step felt like punctuation. Behind him, no one laughed anymore. For a moment, the ballroom seemed to hold its breath. Then, somewhere near the back, a voice said quietly, "I got it all." It was the young Latina server, same trembling hands, same phone half hidden behind a tray. But now her eyes were steady. "I recorded everything," she whispered to no one in particular, just loud enough for those nearest to hear. People turned, chairs scraped, the air shifted again. Malcolm stopped mid-step, glancing over his shoulder. His voice came soft, measured. "Keep it. Truth deserves witnesses." Edward's fiancée hissed, "She can't film us, that's illegal." The girl swallowed hard. "So is humiliation," she said, barely above a whisper, but the words carried further than she expected. Across the room, another server, a tall black man in his late 30s, set down his tray and folded his hands in front of him. "She's right," he said. "I saw the whole thing too," the crowd murmured. A few guests, those who had chuckled earlier, were suddenly fidgeting with their cuffs, pretending to check messages. Malcolm's voice stayed calm. "You don't need to argue," he told them gently. "You already did enough by standing still." He turned back toward Edward, who now looked like a man trying to find the floor beneath his ego. "This isn't about one insult," Malcolm said. "It's about a system that still thinks dignity wears a name tag." The orchestra fell silent again, as if even the instruments were ashamed. From the corner, a journalist from Forbes Live, who had been invited to cover the merger, quietly lifted her camera. "Mr. Reed," she asked, "is this your official statement regarding the Langford deal?" Malcolm met her gaze. "Not yet," he said, "but it will be." Edward shot up from his chair. "You can't use that footage. This is a private event." The journalist didn't blink. "So was the merger until 5 minutes ago." A ripple of quiet laughter spread, not mocking this time, but cleansing. People who hadn't dared to speak earlier now nodded subtly, some even clapping once before catching themselves. The young Latina stepped forward, voice firmer now. "You shouldn't talk to him like that," she said to Edward. He didn't even raise his voice. Edward turned on her, face flushed. "Watch your tone." But before he could finish, Malcolm spoke again softly, almost kindly. "Don't." The single word froze the room. He walked back toward the group, eyes calm, footsteps unhurried. "You already revealed who you are," he said to Edward. "She just revealed she still knows what respect looks like." The journalist lowered her camera slightly, her tone professional but hushed. "Mr. Reed, may I quote that?" Malcolm nodded. "Quote it, print it, broadcast it. Maybe someone will learn before they hire the next Edward." A few guests stifled nervous chuckles. Others simply looked away, faces red with realization. The power dynamic had shifted so completely that even the chandeliers seemed to hum differently, no longer symbols of luxury, but of exposure. Then came the moment that changed everything. The sound of a phone vibrating on the table. It was Edward's. The screen flashed. "Langford board urgent." He hesitated. Answered. "Edward," a voice snapped from the speaker, audible to everyone nearby. "What the hell happened? The deal's gone." "The market's reacting already." Gasps scattered like sparks. Someone whispered, "It's real, the deal's really off." Malcolm didn't gloat. He simply adjusted his cufflinks the same way his father used to before leaving work and said quietly, "Some lessons don't need shouting, just consequences." He turned again toward the exit. Behind him, the servers stood taller. The journalist kept filming. The crowd watched in reverent silence, not out of fear, but respect newly born. And the young Latina whispered to herself, "That's how justice sounds." Edward Langford III stood frozen, the phone still in his hand, his board's voice echoing faintly before he slammed it down on the table. The sharp crack of glass meeting marble cut through the silence. "That's enough," he snapped. "You think you can embarrass me in front of my investors?" No one answered. The crowd had turned into an audience silent, alert, unwilling to miss a word. Edward jabbed a finger toward Malcolm. "Security!" he barked again, louder this time. "Get this man out before I—" "Before you what?" Malcolm's tone was quiet, but the interruption hit like a gavel. The guards hesitated once more. They'd seen the executives flanking Malcolm, seen the murmured recognition ripple through the guests, seen the journalists start filming again. One of them shifted uncomfortably. Mr. Langford, he said cautiously, we were told not to intervene unless there was a threat. Edward turned on him. He is the threat. Malcolm tilted his head. No, I'm the consequence. The words landed heavy. The blonde fiancée grabbed Edward's arm. Please, just stop, she whispered. This isn't a fight you can win. He yanked his arm away. You think I'm going to bow to him? He turned back toward Malcolm, anger twisting his face. You walk in here, uninvited, act like you run the place. I don't act, Malcolm said. I execute. Gasps. A few phones rose higher, recording openly now. Edward's confidence collapsed into rage. You think because you have money, you can humiliate me? Malcolm took a measured breath. I don't have money, he said. I have ownership. There's a difference. The crowd stirred again, whispers mixing with disbelief, admiration, and a kind of nervous awe. Even the journalists had stopped pretending neutrality. One of them muttered, he just dismantled him with a sentence. It not a great grain. Canusis filing in planes of the radep. Edward's voice cracked as he shouted, you can't cancel a $50 billion merger with a phone call. Malcolm's expression didn't change. You're right. That's why I used 3. Behind him, one of his executives received a buzz on his phone, nodded once, and stepped forward. Sir, confirmation received, he said clearly. Funds withdrawn. All Langford accounts frozen pending review. The blonde's hand flew to her mouth. Oh my God! Edward's complexion drained to the color of paper. You wouldn't dare. Malcolm leaned forward slightly, his voice so calm it was almost merciful. I already did. A soft, collective inhale rippled across the ballroom. Even the chandeliers seemed to dim for a second, as if the building itself acknowledged what had just shifted. The older guests, the ones who'd quietly tolerated the cruelty earlier, began murmuring to each other. Some shook their heads in disapproval, not of Malcolm, but of Edward. One woman whispered. He warned him. Twice. Edward looked around, realizing that the allies who'd once laughed beside him were now stepping away. His fiancée slipped off her chair, eyes lowered, moving quietly toward the exit. Where are you going? He hissed. She didn't turn around. Somewhere dignity still matters. Their wind of one. Malcolm didn't follow her with his eyes. He was focused on the guard, who still stood uncertainly near the corner. No need to escort anyone, he said. The story's walking itself out. The crowd parted again as Edward stumbled back, his bravado evaporating under the heat of humiliation. You'll regret this, he spat. No one does this to me. Malcolm adjusted his cufflinks, voice level, unshaken. Correction, he said. You did this to yourself. The room went silent, not out of fear, but because truth had just taken the floor. And somewhere near the back, the young Latina whispered to a colleague. He's not shouting, but every word sounds louder than thunder. It is an all-go. The tension in the ballroom had shifted from arrogance to something sharper desperation. Edward Langford stood trembling, the tremor of a man whose power had finally met its ceiling. His breath came shallow, his jaw clenched until the muscles twitched. You think this is over? He said, voice cracking. You think you can walk in here, destroy my reputation, and just leave? Malcolm didn't answer. He stood still, a storm wrapped in stillness. The orchestra had long stopped playing. Even the waiters had vanished to the edges of the room. The only sound left was the faint clinking of ice melting in half-empty glasses. Edward stepped closer, invading the space between them. You don't belong here, he hissed, spittle catching the light. This is our world, not yours. Malcolm's gaze didn't move. Then you should have built it yourself. The sentence was calm, precise, and it broke something in Edward. He reached for the glass beside him, the same one Malcolm had placed neatly on the table earlier, and in a motion too quick for thought, he threw it. The crystal shattered against Malcolm's chest and exploded across the marble floor. Red wine splattered over the black tuxedo like accusations, silent, deliberate, final. Gasps echoed through the ballroom. Someone shouted, "Oh my God!" Another voice, trembling, said, "He just threw that at him." The young Latina's phone caught every frame. The camera light blinked once, steady, unblinking, like truth refusing to look away. Malcolm looked down at his jacket, then slowly back up at Edward. Not anger, not shock, just clarity. He removed the stained pocket square, folded it once, and set it gently on the table. "You just made this official," he said. Edward sneered. What are you gonna do? Call your lawyers? Malcolm's voice stayed even. No. I call my standards. He took out his phone again, that same device that had already changed the fate of $50 billion, and pressed one button. Carla, he said, his tone deliberate, cold as marble. Initiate legal containment. Record begins now. The speakers in the ballroom buzzed faintly. Carla's voice came through crisp and composed. Confirmed. Recording live. Incident logged under contract breach protocol. Edward's color drained. You wouldn't. Malcolm cut him off, finally raising his eyes to meet him head-on. You hit the man who owns the floor you're standing on. The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was heavy, sacred, like a courtroom's pause before a verdict. Behind them, one of Malcolm's executives stepped forward, phone in hand. Sir, he said loud enough for the crowd. Security footage synced. Legal timestamp verified. Witnesses documented. Edward backed up a step. This isn't you can't just. Malcolm advanced one step forward, slow but unstoppable. You just turned humiliation into evidence, he said. Congratulations, Edward. You didn't just lose a deal. You built my case. A nervous laugh from someone in the corner broke under its own weight. The blonde fiancé, still near the doorway, whispered, He warned you. Malcolm reached into his inside pocket, pulled out a small black card identical to the one he'd shown earlier, and dropped it into the spilled wine at Edward's feet. The silver lettering shimmered under the light. Reed Global Holdings, founder and CEO. You mistook silence for submission, Malcolm said quietly. That was your last mistake. The crowd erupted in murmurs, shock, awe, vindication. The journalist raised her camera again, framing the moment as Edward stumbled back, speechless, surrounded by proof and witnesses. Malcolm turned away, leaving the shattered glass glinting like fragments of a crown fallen too soon. And in that moment, everyone in the room knew the insult had become the evidence, and justice had already started recording. Malcolm didn't move fast. He didn't have to. The rhythm of the room had changed from chaos to calculation. Every guest could feel it. The shift from victim to architect. He lifted his phone again. Carla, he said, his voice low but clear. Move to containment protocol. Immediate freeze on Langford assets and contracts under review. Begin full audit. Her response came through the speakers. Firm, professional, chilling in its precision. Confirmed, sir. Initiating cross-hold review. Estimated total affected, 4.8 billion. Live updates enabled. Gasps scattered like falling glass. The journalist's camera light flared brighter. Murmurs became ripples of disbelief. Edward staggered backward. You can't do that. That's my company. Malcolm met his eyes. Correction, he said evenly. That was your company. You forfeited it the moment you mistook me for your help. The blonde fiancé let out a trembling exhale. Oh my God, he's serious. Malcolm turned slightly toward the two Reed Global executives who had been waiting near the entrance. Gentlemen, he said, you can inform our board. The acquisition has been terminated permanently. Effective now. One of them nodded, typing quickly on his tablet. Statement drafted, sir. Press team standing by. The journalist in the back leaned forward, sensing history. Edward's voice was breaking now, a fragile thing pretending to be fury. You'll regret this. I'll call every investor I know. Malcolm interrupted softly. You already did. They're watching. And then a set of the possible with settable bass. He gestured toward the far wall, 3 screens mounted for tonight's merger presentation. Carla's live feed flickered onto them, displaying the Reed Global dashboard. Transaction logs streamed in real time. A line of text appeared across the display. Merger status, terminated. Authorized by M. Reed, founder and CEO. The entire ballroom gasped as one. Edward's last thread of arrogance snapped. He lurched forward and slammed his hand against the table. You can't humiliate me like this in front of everyone. Malcolm's voice was almost gentle. Edward, he said, you did that part yourself. I'm just finishing the paperwork. A did and still 7 and says, in sums, inline presses. Soft laughter rose from somewhere in the back, hesitant, then bolder. A guest whispered, that's what dignity looks like. Another murmured. He warned him 3 times. Malcolm turned to the young Latina server still holding her phone. Send your video to this address, he said, showing her a card. Legal will handle the rest. You'll be compensated for your courage. She blinked, overwhelmed. Sir, I didn't do it for money. He nodded once. That's why you deserve it. The room stayed hushed, reverent, electric. Malcolm looked back to Edward one final time. You called security on me in my own deal, he said. Now you'll learn what real security looks like. He pressed one more button. The ballroom screens changed again, showing a digital signature Edward Langford III, removed from contract authorization access. Effective immediately, Carla's voice echoed through the room. Mr. Langford no longer holds signatory power for any pending transactions. The last bit of color drained from Edward's face. He sank into his chair, stunned, muttering, "This can't be happening." Malcolm adjusted his cufflinks, the faintest smile tracing his lips. It already did. He turned to the crowd, his tone calm, resolute. If anyone's confused about tonight, he said, just remember this. Power doesn't need to shout to be heard. In his heaven in seem all of Siles, in his heavenum. The journalist lowered her camera and whispered to her colleague, that line's going viral before midnight. Malcolm Reed stood in the center of the ballroom, a single figure of calm in a sea of panic. The silence was thick enough to hear every breath, every nervous shuffle. He looked around the room at the faces that had laughed, dismissed, doubted. Then he spoke. Not loud, not rushed, but with the weight of inevitability. My name, he said, is Malcolm Reed, founder and chief executive officer of Reed Global Holdings. The words fell into the air like steel. Somewhere in the crowd, a glass slipped from a guest's hand and shattered, unnoticed. I built the very platform that carried your merger, he continued. Every investor you've been trying to impress tonight, they answer to me. Edward's jaw hung open. His fiancée covered her mouth with both hands. He's the Malcolm Reed? She whispered, as if saying it too loud would make it more real. The journalist from Forbes Live took a cautious step forward. Mr. Reed, she said, voice trembling between awe and professionalism. Are you confirming that Reed Global owns a controlling share of Langford International? Malcolm turned slightly toward her. Owned, he corrected. Past tense. As of 5 minutes ago, those shares were redistributed to firms that actually understand respect. There was no audible. A ripple of gasps and whispers spread like fire across the hall. The chandelier light seemed to sharpen, casting every stunned expression into relief. Edward shook his head, pale, disbelieving. You tricked me. Malcolm's eyes didn't move. No, you revealed yourself. The blonde fiancée spoke softly, voice cracking. We thought you were staff. Malcolm's gaze was steady. You were right, he said. I serve people, just not the ones who think they're above everyone else. The crowd broke into quiet murmurs, a mixture of awe and guilt. A few guests nodded subtly, their expressions changed from superiority to respect. Even the guards straightened, realizing who they'd almost escorted out. The journalist whispered into her mic, "This moment will redefine corporate ethics. Live from New York." Malcolm stepped back, his voice now softer, almost reflective. For years I've walked into rooms like this and watched power mistake itself for class. Tonight, I just proved they're not the same thing. He turned slightly, meeting Edward's eyes one last time. You wanted to see power? You just shook its hand. And then he walked away calm, composed, leaving behind a ballroom that no longer belonged to the Langfords, but to the truth. The spell broke all at once. Phones lifted, flashes burst, whispers swelled into disbelief. Edward Langford's empire was unraveling in real time, and everyone was watching. His phone buzzed relentlessly on the table, screen flashing, investor exit 17 pending calls. His fiancée had already slipped out through the side door. His board members were nowhere in sight. The crowd that once laughed at his jokes now stepped back, as if his arrogance were contagious. Across the room, the young Latina server stood taller, no longer hiding her phone. It's still recording, she whispered, and for the first time, she sounded proud. Malcolm turned toward her, nodded once, a silent acknowledgement that dignity recognized dignity. The journalist was speaking live now, her tone reverent. What began as humiliation has turned into corporate history. The man they mocked now holds every card. Edward finally crumbled into his chair, face pale, voice cracking. You ruined me. Malcolm stopped near the exit, looked back only once. No, Edward, he said quietly. You educated yourself. Gasps fluttered through the room like wind through glass. The orchestra, uncertain what to do, began playing again, this time slow, solemn, almost like an apology. And as Malcolm walked out, the guests parted for him, not out of fear but respect, the kind reserved for those who never needed to shout to prove who they were. Malcolm stopped just short of the doorway, his reflection caught in the glass, calm, resolute, untouchable. He raised his phone one last time. "Carla," he said, voice steady as command. "Finalize termination. Remove Edward Langford and all senior associates from system access. Freeze remaining assets, effective immediately." Her voice came crisp through the speaker. "Confirmed, sir. Langford International locked. Access revoked. Legal documentation issued for cause. Misconduct and breach of contract." A collective gasp rippled through the ballroom. Edward shot to his feet, wild-eyed. You don't have that authority." Malcolm turned, his gaze calm but absolute. "I am the authority." He slid the phone back into his pocket and buttoned his jacket. Around them, the screens flashed red. "Access denied E. Langford." The journalists caught every frame. The crowd watched in stunned silence as Edward's badge on the display blinked once and vanished. It was over. Quietly, legally, irreversibly. Malcolm took one last look at the ruined empire before him. "Consider this," he said softly, "your severance package." Then he walked out, leaving behind the echo of his own restraint. A man who didn't need revenge because justice had already signed the paperwork. Outside the ballroom, night air met Malcolm's face, cool, still, clean. The city lights shimmered against his reflection in the glass doors. Voiceover. He never raised his voice. He never needed to. Because justice doesn't shout, it signs the deal and walks away. He adjusted his cufflinks, took one slow breath, and stepped into the waiting car. Behind him, the ballroom lights dimmed, not in shame, but in recognition. Title card, $50B deal canceled.